This interview is brought to you by lynda.com.
Easily one of my favorite games from last year was the Stanley Parable. It was a game that was pretty much about games, addressing issues of choice and the meanings behind it, as well as the role of narrative inside of games, all wrapped up with a deliciously sardonic tone. So with that in mind, I'm very happy to introduce the two men behind the game, Davey Reedon, I did it right this time, and William Pugh. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely, thank you for having us.
Yeah. So I was thinking about the game this morning ahead of this interview, and I'm curious when and how you decided on Stanley, because it now sounds so perfect with the name and the tone of the game. But I'm curious if any other names had crossed your mind before you settled on that one.
This sounds dismissive of people who are named Stanley, but it occurred to me in the beginning as just a name that of someone who would like blend into the background, right? Like some, like there, not like with some kind of presence, but mostly invisible, like kind of striking this right balance where if you were so inclined, you could completely ignore the fact that Stanley even exists. I don't know, it just seemed like the right name.
So I'm curious, like, at what point you decided to do a game. I mean, I want to call it existential. I mean, it obviously violates a lot of sort of the principles of what a good game is supposed to be. It doesn't have challenge. It has choices that are almost arbitrary, even though they develop into something. Mm-hmm. And you definitely took on something that was quite ambitious, and obviously you're a team of two.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the all of what you're talking about like started with a question for me about, like, it literally just started with the two doors. And because I liked narrators and trying to imagine if I had only a narrator, what could I do in an environment that would still be compelling, like literally with nothing else going on? And the two doors was just like the first thing that came to mind, and it stuck in my mind because I couldn't make sense out of it, because the narrator says Stanley walked through the left door, so it's in the past tense, but you still have the ability to go through the right door, and if you could do it multiple times, how would that reconcile? Would they be considered a part of the same game? Would they be separate games? These were questions that I like. In just trying to even hold and contain that scenario, it was impossible. And so the conclusion that I came to then was that, okay, this is going to be an impossible game. This is going to have to be an inherently contradictory game. And I kind of like that snapped into place, and it was like, okay, now I'm free.
I mean, it's if you go back through literature, you can look at William Faulkner or Nabokov or even Joseph Conrad, and you see works that try to challenge the idea of the authority of the narrator. And it's really interesting though when you look at that with games where there is usually a story and you're giving the player sometimes the illusion of agency inside of it. And this really kind of addresses that head on. And you're supposed to, I mean, I think most people when they first play the game, that first playthrough, you're not going to do what the narrator's telling you. You're almost just going to work in absolute opposition.
Yeah.
Really?
Oh yeah, very much. See, the thing is, people don't talk about it when they go through the door on the left.
Yeah.
Everyone who goes through the door on the right,
it's like a big decision.
Yeah, it's like a big thing.
Like when they'll
come back to us. They'll come back to us, and they'll be like, "You never."
Yeah.
I went right through the door.
Yeah.
No one who goes through the door on the left ever. It's just like you guys are never gonna believe. I love authority. I am such a slave to, like, no one comes back and like says that.
But I mean, it's weird. I mean, it's you're going through a door, but there is that sense of like, look at me, I'm taking charge, and I'm going to do exactly what the opposite. It's yes, even for me, it was kind of oddly thrilling. It's a very strange sensation.
Well, I think the design of that came from the kind of removal of kind of gameplay from the kind of design process, because it allowed us to kind of focus kind of more directly on the notion of player agency and kind of choice and that kind of area for the player to kind of express themselves within this kind of game space. Because when you're not shooting people or trying to reach this point in a certain time, it kind of it opens other things up that kind of otherwise, as a game designer, you might kind of let fall by the wayside.
And that was initially like a technical limitation. That was because setting out to actually like mess around with the source development kit, I didn't even know how to make guns, right? Like how to actually if I wanted to, I wouldn't even know how to do that, right? And so it was like, okay, what's the most that can be done. Like, I was just I'm curious, right? You know, like that's what we want to know. Like, if all that we had was a narrator, was a voice talking to you, could you literally make that compelling with just empty hallways?
I mean, and this really feeds into, I think, a large debate that's going on, where, you know, a game like yours, a game like Gone Home, these games that are not positing challenge and, you know, trying to almost keep the player from finding the conclusion of the game, you know, is that a game? Is it not a game? I mean, was that something that you guys were thinking about? You know, that, you know, by just saying choice and do whatever, and it's going to, you know, you're going to find some way to the end of this story.
I think that the question of what are games is kind of one that's very kind of fun and interesting to talk about, but not. I don't think having a definition is especially useful. I know, like, my kind of answer to that is everyone's got their own kind of idea about what a game is, and like, it's good for you. It might be good for you personally to have a definition and be able to point at things and say that's.
My answer is who cares?
Yeah, well, I was trying to provide like. I was trying to provide content. Right.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Just say no or yes. You're embarrassing me in front of Adam Sessler. I only get this one chance. I only get this one chance.
I'll stop ruining it. William, I'll stop ruining the interview.
So, Adam.
But I mean, I guess what's interesting is, once again, you know, Stanley Parable is kind of about Stanley trying not to be Stanley. You know, finding himself in a new situation, trying to break free. Very similar to sort of what we're seeing happening in sort of innovative ways of approaching narrative and game structure. I mean, I don't know. What I love so much about the game is it seems to feed into this very discussion so easily.
Well, I mean, what's always important for me, and that like kind of doesn't usually get talked about very much in conversations about the game, is that like the other side of it is sometimes you have to be that thing, right? Like sometimes you have to live in your own skin, right? Like Stanley doesn't want to be Stanley, but he kind of has to deal with it, right? And I don't think that Stanley Parable is a rejection of video game structure and of video game like narrative as we think about it. I think it's, if anything, I think we just wanted it to kind of like highlight the negotiation that happens between those multiple points, right? Like not that this one is good or that one is bad or this is the way forward or this is regressive or anything like that, but just that as a culture, we're bouncing around a lot. You know, we're always in motion, we're always moving, or at least like I hope we are, right? Like I just hope we're moving. I want like shift and change, and for us to continue to be like aware of that as it happens, and to look at it and be like, oh, cool, we're shifting and changing. That's pretty interesting, like in and of itself. Like that awareness, I think that's the core thing, not the change itself. The change is going to happen, right? Like that's out of my hands. We did not change the industry with Stanley Parable. It was already like well underway before we had anything to say about it. Stanley Parable is just like, hey, let's just look at what's going on and acknowledge that it's going on and just kind of like keep that, like be mindful about that, basically, about the fact that that change is happening, so we're not like resisting it when it does.
Yeah, and I think for me, kind of something about the nature of kind of game developers and games kind of changing and progressing is because I think for a period of time, most game developers' only cultural point of reference was other games. And I think now, especially with kind of tools opening up and things like Unity and Unreal kind of opening their gates to kind of more people, that allows people who maybe their primary background is in film or literature or kind of theatre to kind of start making games and expressing kind of ideals and notions from their kind of primary mediums in this kind of new one.
So, you know, yeah, there's no guns. There's no challenge, but if you think about how you're yeah, that's true. I've yet to figure out everything that's inside of this game, and that's my question. How did you approach designing something where you really are asking the player to try to break or to try to violate what you think the game is supposed to do? How do you design levels?
You look at what people are doing. Yeah, it's easy. You just look at what people actually like do in games, and it just emerges.
Well, yeah, because the development cycle was 2 years, and we thought it was going to be 6 months. So kind of we had a first kind of primitive kind of bone structure of the game after about 6 months, and we kind of then just started going through that, and we'd see where maybe a part wouldn't quite work, or maybe where something felt a bit bland, and we felt like we could have something like a broom closet or kind of a window where the player could escape from, like here, where, and then kind of just
It's just like
It's
little.
just,
It
yeah,
just
it's
kind
just
of like
little
gets
stuff.
tacked on.
It's kind
like,
of feature creep, and
it just starts to emerge, you know. Like we'd put the game in front of someone, and they would
and
try
then like
to.
they'd stand still in a room for a while, and
we'd be like, okay, we got to have that respond. You
Now,
know?
is that how the broom closet came about?
I forget.
I think the broom closet came about because there were, I think, there was like a large space of game area where the player kind of never came up against anything kind of interactive, and another one we kind of had this idea about a choice of kind of remaining somewhere or choosing to leave and kind of playing with that.
Yeah,
and
so-
it was stupid, so
Well,
it was funny.
all of those were just like, oh, people are interacting with the game in these various ways. So I'm sure there was a point where like someone stood around in a spot like waiting for the narrator to say something else, like thinking there would be something and maybe there wasn't. So we're like, okay, we've got to create an environment where the narrator is specifically responding to you doing nothing, right? Like what's every way that we can think of to have the narrator bounce back against something that you're doing. So when we see people, like there'd be all these times where like people would be in a place, in a room, trying to do something, trying to get like some feedback from the narrator, and they wouldn't get it, and we'd be like, all right, cool, now we got to add that, right? Now we have to make the game push back against what they're doing.
But I think a large kind of portion of it is maybe a bit of luck that we kind of maybe
but you just
stumbled upon.
The luck is just we just threw things in.
Yeah.
Like okay, like this will maybe be something interesting, and you put it in front of people, and if someone's actually engaged by it, then cool, then it goes in. Like the number of times that we like continued to come back to previous like things that were already in the game, you know, like enough.
Like the demo, like there were 2 revisions of that before the one that went out to the public, and both of those were really, really bad.
Yeah.
They were just awful, and we were like,
See, I'm trying to think what bad is in the world of
bad is-
Stanley
no, no, no,
Parable.
we had a room where the player would walk in and the narrator would give you a monologue for like minutes on end, and there was no kind of level of interaction and play, and it was kind of just really boring.
It was
for
just
people.
talking to you,
yeah.
right? And like that was it was funny because that was so late in development that we'd like I guess forgotten what actually made the interaction.
Yeah, because we were
interesting.
trying to build it within the context of the game as a wider whole, but it was a kind of individual piece of content that we had to kind of, so it was kind of like learning how to make a game again.
It was you had to re-figure out like why. So like we would do stuff where like you'd think after 4 years you would like actually understand like what makes this game interesting, but no, like we went and designed a thing where you like stood in a room for like 5 minutes while the narrator talks, and there's like one button that you can push like in the middle of that, and like that's it. And we looked at it, and we were like, how did we forget this? Like, why did we think
That's what happens when you give a writer a bit of power. Yeah.
Well, let me tell you, I think we turned it around. I think, but we had to have gone through that to see what was and was not working for people, right? Like to know that we were not actually responding. You know, we weren't actually giving players something to be expressive about, right? Like that, especially later on. Like I think the demo started to, by the time we got to the demo, like this became a really big point of focus in the design was give the player room for expression, right? Like this started to congeal in our like kind of minds, and especially when the first demo failed, and then we were like, what is it that needs to happen here? It congealed on this design point of the player needs to have a room for unique expression that makes their play theirs. You know, that's not what we're giving.
But also, it's and this is what I think is so fascinating is that they're doing their unique expression, but it's also sort of the sanctification from the narrator.
Yeah.
The idea that they're being acknowledged. And I think there's almost like a Samuel Beckett type fear that if that narrator was to go away, you really do kind of cease to exist in this world.
It's a safe space, you know? It's like, that's what we're trying, and that's part of why the narrator being as warm and affirming as he is like so important. I mean, that's the quality of the voice acting that I think otherwise would not have worked for this, is we need you to feel like you're welcome here, like you're invited. You know, the charm of the narrator is in being able to take this inherently very contradictory space and tell people like, no, it's okay, just like come and play, right? Like I will respond to you. If you step up to the plate, I will make you feel welcome here, you know? And also that was the strength of the level design, I think, was to be not like, you know, it's an office building, but it's still warm. It's still got a kind of a charm to it that, like, without that, I think it would have been really hard to engage people, for people to continue to ask people to come back, like, come back again, try again, like, do another thing, right? Like, you ask a lot.
Yeah, the song we've kind of been singing since Stanley came out is the kind of notion of a game as a stage for each player to kind of go up on and improvise.
Yeah, but the stage has to be welcoming.
Interesting.
Yeah, right. Well, interesting.
I mean, I've said this about some games. It's like it's kind of like asking someone to spend time at your house, and if your house is smelly and cramped and filled with unpleasant things, you don't want to stay there all that long. I completely see where you're coming from.
Yeah. And so, like, again, that was like a process over time. That was like, we would put things in that, because there are some very, like, difficult, it's weird, like, the line where, like, on one side of it, the game is difficult but engaging, and on the other end, it's difficult but brutal. And, like, we had a really hard time figuring sometimes out where that was. Like, we would play sections that, like, asked the people to just, like, run around in circles and do nothing, and they would love it. But
it's anxiety-inducing sometimes when you get caught in that, when you're just going around and around.
But, like, sometimes they would love it, and then, like, we had another section. So, like, at the moment in the game, there's a bit where you, like, walk upstairs and jump off, and the narrator's asking you, like, like,
that kind
not to
of
jump.
came from an earlier iteration of an ending called the suicide ending, which just kind of it was about.
It was
like
the same
5 times as long, and each time you went up, there would be a bit of narration, jump off, joke, and then it just kind of. But then you lose the kind of player interaction there.
What happened was the narrator wanted you to jump, right? You were like, when he was saying, "Here, this is for you to go and, like, jump off of this thing, right, to kill yourself." He's enjoying himself from it, and people hated it. Like, they hated having to go through that at, like, the narrator's mercy. Like, we thought there were good jokes, but people didn't care about the jokes.
There's only one way to go, and it's just like a big long line, and then you lose kind of player expression.
Well, because what we did was we added an alternative to that. We added a room you can go to where the narrator is, like, actually happy, right? Where he is, like, content, and he wants you to stay in that room and do nothing, but you can only advance the game by going and killing yourself, right? Because then the game will restart and you'll actually, like, get to do more stuff. And so, like, as soon as we added, like, a bounce back, like, we thought that it would be funnier if we thought it would be more compelling if you were, like, under the narrator's vice grip, but actually by letting go, by having the narrator fight, like, not fight, but, like, push back against your decisions, there was suddenly player expression there.
Yeah, and it kind of coaxes kind of individual kind of paths through like, space.
You get to you get to decide how you want to do that, right? Like, suddenly people are having their own experiences of either going immediately and just killing themselves, or, like, going back and forth, like, a bit, or going to the other room and just staying there and restarting the game and not even doing any of that other stuff. Suddenly there's like room. There's, like, it becomes a stage rather than just one thing that when there's only one thing you can do. Like, people actually really dislike that. I know we make a joke about that in Stanley Parable, but, like, actually people really dislike that, and we don't want that. That's not as compelling to prove that you dislike having no options. There's nothing. There's nothing very significant about that.
So I think my final question is, in Stanley Parable, I'm trying to think of a nice way of phrasing this, but is it really kind of about the illusion of freedom? Because yes, there's all this freedom, but when you consider what it really kind of gets Stanley, in any way that you play it, it just, yes, you have all the freedom in the world, but it's almost without meaning.
I think we might have been able to answer that question properly about maybe a year ago, 6 months ago, but it's been out and we've played it so many times and seen so many other people play it. I don't think we can really see anything in the game anymore. It's kind of just like a bright white light that we just can't kind of penetrate.
But I mean, in even.
But Davey's going to give a serious interview answer.
Well, I don't know, but I mean, like, but actually, you're right, and in and amongst that, like, being blinded by that light, I have certainly had to try to disengage from it and get back to what I actually do feel about the game and what I actually do believe, like, before all of that, before there was any recognition, before, like, when it was just like there was just a little idea here, and I did have those, beliefs and opinions about, you know, what does it mean, and I've been trying actually to return to that for me, because the response has been, because it's so easy to lose my belief about it in and amongst everyone who's like already talking about it, you know. It's like, it's actually really much harder than it might seem to remember what you've thought about those things in the first place. It's like, it's taken time to get back. And the more that I do, actually, the more that I see that I do believe there is something there. Like, I'm remembering what I used to feel about that very question, right? And maybe it's too personal at this point. Maybe I need to keep it for me, you know?
Well, keep it there.
Yeah.
And if that also helps, you know, facilitate anything new that comes down the line, I cannot wait to play it, guys.
Stanley Parable 2.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. This is a great interview.
Well,
Thank
wonderful.
you.
I'm wonderful. It's been a pleasure talking to you, man. Yeah.
One thing to really consider is that it's not just about programming to make it in the game industry. There's a wide breadth of skills that are applicable, and you can learn some of those by checking out lynda.com. They're an online learning company with more than 77,000 video tutorials that teach software, creative, and business skills. You can learn anytime, anywhere, and at your own pace with courses in web design, 3D and animation, design, programming, and many more, with new courses being added every week. Membership starts at only $25 per month, but you can try lynda.com free for 7 days, and you're supporting Rev3 Games, all by signing up at lynda.com/Rev3Games.